Afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our webinar today. Just waiting a minute for folks to get let in, and we'll go ahead and get started. Looks like the doors are open. So welcome everyone to our webinar today on initiating clinical trials in Canada. This webinar is being hosted by Increasing Capacity for Maternal and Pediatric Clinical Trials, or the Impact Clinical Trial Training Platform. And a big thank you to our friends over at Accelerating Clinical Trials who helped us promote today's session. On a national level, we encourage all Canadians and visitors to Canada to learn about the Indigenous peoples and the lands in which they live, work, and visit, and become engaged allies together. We as Canadians, in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, respect the self-determination of First Nation, Métis, and Inuit, and their rights and responsibilities in culture, language, and the pursuit of wellness. And I just wanted to acknowledge that I'm currently hosting today's session from the beautiful sunny Territory 1, which is the land that is now cared for and continues to be cared for by the Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, Ojibwe, Cree, and Dene people, and is, of course, the homeland of the Red River Métis. Our objectives for today's session are to cover clinical trial initiation in Canada. So we are going to talk about some practical consideration, understanding the essential steps and regulatory processes involved in getting clinical trials approved and started. We're going to talk about budgets. How do we create a comprehensive budget for at the site level and also the study level for clinical trials? And what kinds of supports and resources are available to help us make decisions about planning for how to do clinical trials here across single sites and multi-sites as well. So I'm going to start by disclosing my bias as the host for today. So both of the speakers have been instrumental in really moving mountains to help support me as a new investigator in clinical trials and as someone who finds herself responsible for leading 3 of these clinical trials now. I'm super grateful for their mentorship and their willingness to share some of their expertise with you all today. So I will introduce the speakers and then I will pass the floor over to them. They have about 30 to 40 minutes of a presentation to go over, and then there will be time for discussion and questions at the end. The webinar will be recorded, so please feel free to leave your questions in the chat box, and I will get to them once the speakers are finished with their slides. So to start, a big welcome to Brianne Stewart. So Brianne serves as the Network Director for Rare Kids Can, the Pediatric Rare Disease Clinical Trial and Treatment Network. She also provides strategic leadership, oversees operations, and drives collaboration within this network. And having joined the Maternal Infant Child Youth Research Network in 2018 as the inaugural Associate Director of Clinical Trials, Brianne is deeply passionate about optimizing the research processes here in Canada to ensure timely and efficient treatment and access to therapies for patients and their families. And joining Brianne today is Laurie Anderson, and Laurie is referred to as my regulatory wizard, if you've ever heard me refer to her as that. So this is her in the real time, and she has spent more than 20 years acting as a Health Canada regulatory specialist, working with academic investigators like myself and researchers and other third parties to facilitate submissions of high quality applications to the many different directorates at Health Canada that she is going to teach us about today. She's collaborated on submissions with national research networks and industry partners, and also has 10 years of experience working in clinical trials as a clinical research associate. So welcome to you both, and I will turn the mic over to you, Brianne.
Thank you. So I just want to start with a disclaimer that the information that is presented today is for educational purposes only, and that there's no warranties or guarantees are made regarding the accuracy, completeness, or reliability of the information provided, as the content may change over time. So you should not rely upon this as a sole source of information. We do encourage you to refer directly to the appropriate regulatory source for exact requirements. So I am going to start out with a little bit of a high level around the expectation and reality of initiating a clinical trial and talk about some of the budgeting components and costs associated. And then I'm going to turn it over to Laurie to talk more about the specific regulatory components. So before we go to the next slide here, Lauren, I just want to set the stage a little bit. This presentation will be geared towards academic or investigator-initiated trials. There are a lot of processes that are the same between industry and academics, but in terms of budgeting and costing, we'll primarily be focusing on the investigator-initiated or academic. So first, the two number one topics that we hear about are how long does it take to start a clinical trial here in Canada, and what are the costs of conducting a clinical trial here? So we'll talk about that. And I'm going to start with timelines for things in study startup. And I'm going to use one of Dr. Lauren Kelly's multi-center pediatric trials testing the tolerability of cannabidiol enriched cannabis herbal extract for chronic headaches, which is a multi-center trial across Canada, with the sponsor being an independent site. So they're not actually a recruiting site, but one of these centers is a community center. So there's some additional challenges with that. But I think it highlights a really good example around expectations and the reality. So with that, Lauren, can you flip to the next slide, please? Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So I was first involved with this trial back in 2021, and this was kind of our projected timeline. So we're going to have a finalized protocol, funding was in place, we will initiate clinical trial agreements. There was, of course, some licensing components related to cannabis that we had to take into consideration. But in February of 2022, so a couple of months later, we could submit our ethics application, receive our ethics, and then 6 months after our initial submission to Health Canada, that we could start team training, site initiation, and enrollment. So that was kind of the projected timeline, and things were running relatively smoothly. Now, if you can flip over to the next slide, this is the reality of the trial. And I have to thank our project manager supporting this project with Lauren Wenley for creating this visual. So this is the actual timeline, and it does go back a little bit earlier. So 2019 was the actual trial idea. And so the end date on this slide does show October of 2024, but I am pleased to announce that I heard that today the final site was actually activated. So from 2019 was kind of the project idea, and the activation across the 3 centers took until March of 2025 to actually get up and going. So just kind of looking at this process, I won't go through all of the details, but you can see there's a number of different components that needed to happen. So contracts had to be put in place, research ethics approvals had to be put in place, IP or investigational product had to be procured. There was some challenges with expiration. Along that way, there's also local and regulatory approvals. So you can see a bit of a time delay between June of 2023 and February of 2024. So one of the sites, the first site that had received their contracts and their ethics relatively early in the process, there was a lag there. And part of that had to do with protocol amendments. So those things come up over time, as well as some of the facility approvals, so lab approvals, for example. So this example just really exemplifies the realities of starting a multi-center trial. Each of these centers across the country, there was one in BC, one in Toronto, which was the community site, and one at IWK on the Atlantic provinces there. They do have independent review processes for ethics, and their contracts timelines are a little bit different. So this is the reality of a trial and how long it can take. I do want to back up a little bit and just focus on the Health Canada submission piece. You can see there that in 2022 of November, so the pink box at the top, was the actual submission, and the approval for that project was received a month later. And I think that speaks to Lori's expertise and having experienced individuals helping to prepare some of those applications. So if you have a high quality application going in, you can have a shorter review timeline and timely reviews. So let's flip to the next slide and talk about some of those bottlenecks that we see in study initiation. I had mentioned investigational product and manufacturing. Now, with the example that I gave, CBD oil, it had a lot of challenges in its own, that it had to be produced like all Health Canada regulated products in a GMP or good manufacturing practice facility. That becomes really challenging when something like CBD is available at the store around the corner, that they don't have those same conditions. But the same is true for other drug trials, for example, that do require procurement of the drug, stability testing, placebo manufacturing, especially in the pediatric space. Sometimes there can be challenges with compounding or producing products that are in child-friendly formats. So we can have some increased delays in that. There's also sometimes we see drug shortages. And so then we kind of need to start back at square one, and all of the documentation for investigational products needs to be submitted as part of that regulatory package. Another delay that we can see is in those regulatory submissions. So as I've mentioned, having a high quality application going in will reduce those approval timelines. Sometimes Health Canada can come back and say that you're missing information. It could be stability testing or quality and manufacturing information about the product, or a protocol that's missing significant components. So we can see Health Canada sending back applications. Contracts is a bottleneck that we often see. For a variety of reasons. There's long legal queues sometimes, or contracts haven't been negotiated. Now, I am pleased to report that there are some streamlining initiatives underway through ACT, so Accelerating Clinical Trials Consortium, that is looking at addressing some of these challenges for academic clinical trial agreements. One example that I'll give right now, and we can talk about this later if there's further questions, is the contracts working group brings together over 50 academic institutions, their affiliated hospitals, as well as the health authorities to work on a governing, or another term that people use for governing is a master, tri-council funded, so this could be CHR funding, participating site agreement. So it's essentially a master clinical trial agreement for interinstitutional parties for clinical trial agreements. So these terms and conditions will be negotiated. Now, that doesn't mean that there's going to be no negotiation, but it means that there'll be a focused negotiation. So study startup timelines and the contracts reviews should be reduced. So I'm very excited about that to help address some of those challenges. Now, another challenge is the ethics review. As some of you may be aware, most of you may be aware, there's no single research ethics review board here in Canada. There are some streamlining initiatives such as Can Review or CHEER in the pediatric space. There's also a lot of jurisdictional streamlining systems like REB Exchange in the West, Clinical Trials Ontario in Ontario, and Nagano in Quebec. But that still leads us to having multiple ethics review processes across the country that does create some delays. Now, again, those are kind of on the for contracts and ethics components. There are delays and challenges that are outside of the study team's control, but there are things that the study team can do to help reduce those timelines. So in terms of contracts, a lot of the language in the contracts, you'll see it referring to as per the protocol, or in accordance with the protocol for things like data transfer. So that means that your protocol has to include information about data, where it's going to, where it's coming from, or it will also say in accordance with the research ethics application and consent forms. So the consent forms need to include specific language for the transferring of data, as one example. So those are things that you can do as a study team so that the contracts team doesn't come back to you asking you to make those adjustments. And then same with the research ethics review piece, having those high quality ethics applications going in, being responsive when the REB does send you questions. Those can really reduce those study startup timelines. And those are some of the pieces that are within your control as a study team or an investigator. Now, the last bottleneck that I'll touch on, and there are several others, but it's institutional and local approvals. So once you have your product, you have your regulatory approval, your no objection letter from Health Canada, you have your contracts, you have your ethics, a large number of institutions do have local approval processes for the space or services that are impacted for research. So that can include lab, pharmacy, diagnostic imaging, space to see your patients in. So those can add some additional delays, but being aware that these things exist is really step one, and knowing the different processes that are required, right from project idea through to patient initiation. So I'm gonna leave the timelines for trials and initiation, and I'm gonna switch gears to the cost of clinical trials. So what does it cost to run a clinical trial here in Canada? There is no simple answer. I wish that there was, and we could take one budget and use it over and over. And the reality of the situation is that each trial is different. It really is dependent on, is it a single center? Is it a multi-center project? Does it involve a drug that's regulated? Is it an advanced therapeutic? Is there a device that's involved? Some clinical trials involve a drug and a device. So that has added layers of complexity. And so Lauren had mentioned in my bio my affiliation with MyCERN, the Maternal Infant Child Youth Research Network. So this is a not-for-profit standalone legal entity that does bring together the 7 pediatric research institutions and affiliated research networks across the country. One of the initiatives that was undertaken at MyCERN was a site costing initiative across those 17 institutions. So I'm going to use some of that data, and I'll share some of that data with you to give you an idea about some of the costs that are associated with a clinical trial. And again, this is not exhaustive. These are some examples. But Lauren, if you could switch to the next slide, please. So from a site level, there's budget considerations for a site level and then an overall study level. But some of those site level considerations are lab fees. Startup fees, based off of the site costing initiative that I had mentioned, range from $1,000 to $2,500. Now that doesn't include processing fees or protocol reviews, amendment reviews, for example. Pharmacy fees for a phase 1 trial, it can range depending on the institution between $500 and $7,000. That also doesn't include dispensing fees, yearly maintenance fees, facility fees. There's a range, and that the range that's listed there does not take into consideration overnight stays that might be needed for a particular project. Diagnostic imaging fees really range. When we talk about staff, how much does a coordinator cost? Through the site costing initiative, the hourly rate on average for a nurse coordinator was $73 per hour. And a research coordinator was $60 per hour. So that's the reality of what happens at institutions and the real costs. Now, overhead, I will touch on. There are some academic institutions that do charge overhead on investigator-initiated projects. So it's important to know this ahead of time and make sure that you're budgeting for it appropriately. Now, of course, there's differences with industry-sponsored trials where all institutions charge an overhead. But just be aware that that's not always the, some institutions do charge for investigator-initiated trials. So that's sometimes a misconception. Archival fees also range, as well as study startup fees and patient compensation. So there might be some caps or limitations on reimbursement for patients. So those are things to consider from a site level. Now, the next slide is switching to kind of study level budget considerations. So especially if you're running a multi-center trial, some things to think about are the cost of your drug. Do you have to pay for your drug? Is it being provided in kind? Do you need to develop placebo? Does it require encapsulation or compounding? Will you have a central lab or pharmacy that's going to do the analysis of your samples, or are local samples, or is the analysis taking place locally? Regulatory support submissions. Do you have an individual who has the expertise to be able to do the regulatory submissions to Health Canada, as well as database? So considering a database build and database management, that can be an expensive cost, and the database needs to be built in a validated database. So it can't just be in any database that maybe you have built on your own. Clinical trial monitoring. This can be remote, it can be on-site, it's risk-based monitoring, but it is a sponsor obligation to provide quality assurance and oversight of the trial. Biostatistical support in design and analysis. Those are important considerations to think about right at the beginning of your trial, as well as project management. Having an individual to help coordinate all of these tasks and making sure that you have consistent information shared amongst the research team. Knowledge translation. So how do we disseminate this information? The development of infographics, graphic designers, for example, as well as data safety monitoring boards. Sometimes an honorarium is helpful when you're creating your DSMB board, and did you capture that? And then, because I gave an example about a clinical trial site that was a community-based site, another important consideration is insurance. If you are sponsoring a trial and you're in the community, you may not have an insurance policy to cover clinical trials like a major academic institution might. So those are all things to keep in mind. Now, the one thing that I will say about this slide is some of these services, depending on the institution that you're at, Your local clinical trials office or research support unit does provide some of these services. So I strongly encourage everyone to connect as you're thinking about building out a budget, applying for a grant, or developing your protocol, to check with your local resources that you do have in place right now and what services are offered, either free for academic projects or at a reduced cost, or what's available. So that's kind of the number one suggestion that I would have with regards to budgeting. Now, if we can skip to the next slide, this will be my last slide. I did want to take a moment. So we talked about some of the costs that are incurred in a clinical trial, and some of those processes that are involved. Now, what happens if your institution does not have expertise or they don't offer services? I do want to make mention that MyCERN does function as an academic research organization. So they do provide a whole suite of services, both in the pre-award phase, so as you're developing your grant or your protocol, and the post-award phase. So once you do have funding that's secured and in place. And I also have listed there Rare Kids Can, because it's a CHR funded initiative that does provide some subsidies and cost reductions for pediatric rare disease trials. So Lauren, if you could just go to the first one. Yeah, you can pop them all up. That's fine. And I'll just speak through them. MyCERN and Rare Kids Can, they do provide consultation and budgeting services. So as you're thinking about creating your project or your grant application, we can tap into that site costing initiative and help you plan for your budget. We can also help in assisting with site and investigator identification. We do have a database of over 110 experts across the country. If you want to take your pilot project and expand it across the country, we can provide supports. Regulatory submissions. Lori is our regulatory expert. And so her services are available to help you with the preparation and submission at a subsidized cost, as well as case report form, so CRF and database management. All of these services that are listed here are either offered directly through MyCERN or Rare Kids, or through our affiliated and associated partners and contractors. But database build and management, we do work with some validated REDCap databases that can provide those services, and there are some subsidies that are involved for the rare disease projects. Ethics, we talked about bottlenecks in multi-site, multi-provincial ethics applications. There is a support service that is currently available through CHEER and MyCERN with an individual that has the access to multiple streamlined systems across the country. So this individual, if you have a multi-site and multi-provincial, so it can't just be multiple sites within a province, but a multi-provincial project, that does require ethics support, there is an individual that can prepare the ethics applications. So again, that high quality application, and submit it simultaneously across the various streamlined systems, with the goal to reduce those study startup timelines. We also provide some support for contracts facilitation based off of experiences and ongoing initiatives, such as those through ACT, as well as quality assurance and clinical trial monitoring and trial project management. We can also offer data safety monitoring boards and individuals for biostatistical design. So really, when you're building out your project, you're setting up your project protocol, as well as the analysis piece. And then resourcing for knowledge translation. So individuals, so that you don't have to hire all of these individuals on your team as experts, but you can utilize them if you don't have that expertise on your team or available to you at your local institution, as well as patient and family partners for patient and family engagement. So in the rare disease side of things, we have a group of patient and family partners that are available for consultation and grant application development and protocol development, consent form reviews. And then we also partner with the Young Persons Advisory Group for general, maternal, and pediatric trials as well. So there are, the point of this slide is that there are some services and some subsidies that are available to help reduce the costs, as well as to improve efficiencies and reduce those study startup timelines. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lori and have her follow up on the second part of the presentation, and then we can come back for discussion.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Brianne. I'm going to apologize right up front. I have very unstable internet today due to weather conditions, so I'm going to stay off camera to get through the presentation so I don't drop off on you, hopefully. So I guess what we want to do now is, Brianne mentioned regulatory requirements in Health Canada's submissions. So we really just wanted to give a brief overview of what projects need to go to Health Canada for approval and what areas of Health Canada will actually do those approvals. Now, as Brianne mentioned, there might be the situation where your study involves both a drug and a device that need regulatory oversight, in which case we, unfortunately, at this point in time, have to do two submissions to Health Canada. There's not time to go into extensive detail about all of the intricacies of these submissions, but I just really hope that we can give you a good overview of the different areas of Health Canada and, again, the related submissions. So currently there are 4 directorates at Health Canada. The first is the Pharmaceutical Drugs Directorate, or PDD. So PDD oversees all drugs. I included here cannabis and psilocybin because I know there's some people on the call who are interested in these areas of research. There's also the Biologics and Radiopharmaceutical Drugs Directorate, or BRDD. So they look after our biological drugs, vaccines, radiopharmaceuticals, and our cell tissue and organ products. Next, we have the Natural Non-Prescription Health Product Directorate, or NNHPD, which oversees natural health products and then over-the-counter drugs. And finally, there's the Medical Devices Directorate. So first, we're going to jump into looking at the clinical trial application process for drugs. So we're encompassing here both pharmaceuticals and biologics. So first, we need to know what is the legislation that mandates us to have to do these clinical trial applications. So the Food and Drugs Act was first passed in 1920 and was most recently revised in 1985. So this is an act that's a law that regulates the production, import, export, transport, and sale of food, drugs, cosmetics, and therapeutic devices in Canada. The food and drug regulations are the main rules that implement the act and specify the requirements for the sale and importation of drugs that are going to be used in our clinical trials. So Part C, Division 5 of the Food and Drug Regulations is where we see the inclusion for the need for a submission of a clinical trial application, or what is known as a CTA, compliance with good clinical practices, or GCP, and then participation in Health Canada's clinical trial auditing program. So for a drug to be used in a phase 1 through 3 clinical trial, so this would be a trial with an unlicensed, unmarketed product, the sale or importation of that investigational product must be authorized by Health Canada prior to initiation of the trial. So this would be done via our initial CTA submission and implementation of any other relevant amendments throughout the course of the trial. Health Canada has a guidance document that you can readily access online that speaks to these clinical trial applications, outlines the elements of them, and gives some nice comparisons between different types of CTA applications, such as notifications and amendments. So from that document, we look at when do we need to submit a CTA. So sponsors have to file a CTA to conduct, as I mentioned before, clinical trials in phases 1 through 3 of drug development. So these are products that are not yet on the market. Clinical trials where the proposed use of the product is being used outside of the approved labeling or being used in an off-label format also require a CTA. So in this case, we'd be looking at using a drug for a different indication, different patient population, route of administration, or dose. So obviously in the pediatric space, this is super important, because approximately 80% of drugs used for pediatric care do not have pediatric labeling, and so they are used off-label. In clinical care, this is completely fine, but the minute we want to do a clinical trial, this off-label use necessitates us to file a CTA. CTAs also have to be filed for products that are licensed in other jurisdictions, but are then not yet approved for use in Canada. So how do you know if your product is licensed by Health Canada or if you're using it per the labeling guidelines? You can go online to Health Canada's drug product database. In this database, you can search by either the brand name, the active ingredient, the manufacturer, and you will be able to see the listing of the drugs that are licensed in Canada. And with most of the drugs, you will get the associated product monograph link here too. So you can access that product monograph, look at the intended use, and see if you're using that drug within the labeling standards. So clinical trial applications consist of up to 5 modules that must be completed and filed prior to the initiation of a clinical trial. Most people are looking at this right now and saying 5, that's strange. Yeah, our guidance speaks to 3, but there are 2 additional modules. Module 4 that includes product study reports, and Module 5 that includes clinical study reports and some literature references. You're not going to generally be submitting or really ever be submitting 5 modules for a CTA. The number of the modules will depend on the product you're using and how it's being used in the trial. So for off-label use of a marketed product, we would generally be looking at Module 1 and perhaps Module 2 based upon if you're doing any changes to the formulation of the product, as an example. Health Canada will review your application and will notify the sponsor if it's found to be deficient within 30 working days after receiving a complete application. So the application will initially go through screening. Once it passes through the screening phase and enters review, that's when that 30-day clock will start. During that time, Health Canada may reach out to you and ask for additional information via an information request. You have 2 business days to respond to those requests to Health Canada. And if you are successful, you will be issued a no objection letter. If not, you will be issued a non-satisfactory notice, or sometimes you may be asked to withdraw without prejudice and just asked to come back and reapply when you're able to have the information that you're missing that Health Canada is looking for. I included this slide here. It's not up to date in terms of the folders, but what I wanted to demonstrate is that a CTA is not just an application form. And I think sometimes people, when they hear this, they think, oh, there's just, you know, a couple of forms I need to fill out. It really is a suite of folders that we have to populate with documentation, depending again upon what the product is, what its licensing status is, and how it's being used. So just, you know, letting you know that it is a little bit of work, and you definitely do have to put some time into getting the required information in order to be able to complete your application. Once you have your no objection letter, there are ongoing obligations to Health Canada. You need to submit CTA amendments or notifications. So if you've made any changes to the study documents, depending on the nature of the change, we're either going to do one of these 2 submissions. If it's an amendment, it's going to go back through that 30-day review process, and we will get another NOL for the amendment. Notification would just be for more administrative changes, and we do not go back through that 30-day formal review period. There is the obligation to have research ethics board approval throughout the duration of the trial and to report to Health Canada any refusals from an REB. We also have to let Health Canada know if we prematurely discontinue the trial, and there is the need to submit annual updated IBs if applicable. There are record-keeping requirements, for example, record retention for 15 years for study documents, and there's the necessity to report serious and unexpected adverse drug reactions to Health Canada. So now we're going to jump into the natural health product world here, just briefly. So the natural health product regulations came into effect in 2004, and these require that all natural health products sold in Canada have a product license before they're marketed. So we have to demonstrate that what the labeling claims are supported by appropriate evidence. Other requirements include site licensing and good practices. The regulations require a CTA for the use of a natural health product that's being used off-label or that's unlicensed in Canada. And we get our approval for this type of an application via a notice of authorization. So similar to drugs, there is a database that you can go onto to search to see if the natural health product that you want to use is licensed in Canada. Licensed health products are issued what's called an NPN number. It's a 7-digit number that confirms the product's been reviewed and approved by Health Canada. Unfortunately, you're not going to see monographs in this database, so you're going to have to look to other product information, product labeling, to see if you are going to be using the drug on label in your study. If not, similar to what I would say for drugs, if you have any questions, you can always reach out to the directorate to get direction and an opinion on whether or not a CTA is going to be required. So now we're going to shift gears and look at medical devices and what is called the investigational testing authorization, which is really the equivalent, it's an ITA, is the acronym, which is really the equivalent to a drug CTA. So Canada has a comprehensive set of regulations for medical devices to ensure their safety, effectiveness, and quality. And these are governed by the Food and Drug Act and the medical device regulations. So the medical device regulations came into force in 1998. And the regulations that are regarding medical devices for investigational testing involving humans are addressed in Section 3 of the MDRs. So what's really important to note here is what is the definition of a device? So a device, you can see here, is a product that is used for diagnosing, treating, mitigating, or preventing a disease, disorder, or abnormal physical state, or any of their symptoms. Or it's used to restore, modify, or correct the body structure or the functioning of any part of the body. There's also devices to be used in diagnosing pregnancy, preventing conception, and caring for humans during pregnancy, at or after birth. So what's really important here, and I always have to hammer home, is if it's represented as a medical device, particularly we're looking at diagnosing, treating, mitigating, or preventing disease, or restoring, modifying, or correcting body structure or function. So we can move to the next slide. So what is an ITA? So an ITA authorizes the sale and or importation of an unlicensed class 2 through 4 medical device into Canada for clinical trials. What's important to note here is that sale does not mean there has to be an exchange of funds. Sale encompasses distribution or leasing. So really, if there's any distribution of a unlicensed product between into Canada or between sites in Canada, you need to look at the need for an ITA. Currently, an ITA can only be submitted by a manufacturer or importer, but they are able to assign clinical and regulatory activities to a principal investigator or qualified investigator in the case of like a PI-initiated trial. An ITA authorization is specific to a protocol. It is not specific to a device. So you can only use that device under your authorization in the exact protocol that was submitted to Health Canada. And this results in getting a letter of authorization from the Medical Devices Directorate. So how do you know if the device you want to use is licensed in Canada? Well, for class 2, 3, and 4 devices, you can look to the Medical Device Active License Listing, or what we call MDAL. And there's a database there that will show that you can search for all licensed class 2 through 4 devices. This does not include class 1 devices. There is a guidance document for ITAs, similar as there is to CTAs, that will walk you through the steps of an ITA application. Again, to the right here, I just wanted to show that the ITA consists of a number of folders that need to be populated. And there really is the need to have a good relationship with the manufacturer to be able to complete these applications. This is just a brief overview. For example, something like a previous studies section, depending on your device, is going to look for testing, including mechanical and bench testing, potentially electrical safety or electromagnetic compatibility, biocompatibility, maybe preclinical studies or software validation and verification. So there's a lot that also goes into an ITA application. So we talk about class 2 through 4 devices. So how do we know really what these device classes are? In Canada, we have 4 classifications, class 1 through 4, with class 1 being the lowest and class 4 the highest. We do not need to do an ITA to use a class 1 device for investigational testing in a clinical trial, but we do for classes 2 through 4. Important to note that the higher the classification, the higher risk and the higher the regulatory requirement. So we're going to have more elements that are required for a class 3 and 4 ITA than we are for a class 2 ITA. And you can look here and see some examples of the different class devices that fall into these classes. And you can see that there's sometimes things here that you might not ever thought were a medical device. So again, we have to be very careful in really considering that definition of a medical device. Health Canada has 2 excellent classification guidance documents, one for in vitro diagnostic devices and one for non-in vitro diagnostic devices. For our non-IVDD classification, they do a very nice job of helping you look at what a classification may be based upon whether a device is invasive, non-invasive, if it's an active device, or if it falls under special rules. Mentioning here, of course, the onus to make the determination as to whether or not a product is represented as a medical device and what classification it is really lies with the manufacturer. I'd love to go into this slide in greater detail. I love this flow chart. It is available in the ITA document that I mentioned previously. And this really helps you walk through whether or not you need to do an ITA. So it's really looking at based upon what is the intended use of the product, what is its licensing status, and what is the involvement of the manufacturer. And you can go through this flow chart and basically be able to determine whether or not you're going to have to file that ITA. Again, if there's any question in your mind, I would highly recommend reaching out to the Medical Devices Directorate to get an opinion from them on whether or not you're going to require a submission. As with drugs, there are post-authorization regulatory obligations in terms of changes to study documents or device information to do a revised authorization. If you're going to discontinue or resume investigational testing, or if the study is complete or you have any site closures. And per the guidance, there is the requirement for investigational testing report after the study is done. This isn't really being enforced, as Health Canada would look for you to be registering these trials in an acceptable registry, such as clinicaltrials.gov, and ensuring that your results are included in such record. I would be remiss if I didn't briefly touch on software as a medical device. I think we have to be aware with the way technology is advancing that we're seeing lots of apps and AI machine learning devices that are considered as medical devices. So how do we know if the software that we're being used is considered to be a medical device? So Health Canada considers software to be a medical device when it's intended to be used for one or more medical purposes as outlined in the definition of device in the Act. So again, we're going to go back to that diagnosing, treating, preventing, mitigating disease, or restoring, modifying, or correcting bodily functions. And it performs these purposes without being part of a hardware medical device. So it can achieve its intended use on its own without being part of a hardware system. Health Canada has another very, very good guidance document that speaks to software as a medical device, what the definition is, and how to go about classifying it. And contained within this guidance document, we can look at you may actually be excluded from what Health Canada sees as a regulated software product. They provide here 4 questions that you can answer in terms of your software. And if you answer yes to all 4 questions, your software is excluded. So this is really, really helpful. They give clarification and examples to go along with it to help you decide, like, I'm not really sure if I need to be considered software as a medical device or not. Definitely refer to this guidance. It is excellent in helping you work through that decision. Now, if you go through those questions and unfortunately you don't answer yes to all of them, then you are software as a medical device. And in terms of classifying your device, you're going to look at 2 things. Really, what is the state of the healthcare situation or condition that your software as a medical device is looking to, it's dealing with, and what is the significance of the information provided? So obviously you can see if you've got a critical healthcare condition and you're using your software to treat or diagnose, that's going to be a class 3 higher risk device than if you're looking at a non-serious healthcare condition and perhaps you're just using it to inform and maybe even to drive patient management. Health Canada has another guidance document that actually for software just is purely classification examples. This is really, really helpful because I know there's a lot of gray areas here. And from this document, there are some examples. So an example of a class 1 software as a medical device could be software that's used in a rehabilitation setting to assess active range of motion. Another example Health Canada provides is software that manipulates or analyzes images and other data obtained from a radiation emitting imaging device, or software that's intended for healthcare professionals that uses an algorithm to analyze patient information. So taking blood pressure, heart rate, and age, and using that algorithm to help determine a treatment plan. So you can see here, that would be a higher risk device, hence the class 2 designation. And finally, looking at class 3 software as a medical device, we could look to software that performs diagnostic image analysis for making treatment decisions in patients with acute stroke, or receives information from an implantable device and allows the user to monitor their condition. Again, higher risk, so higher classification. Some exclusion examples, software that's only really intended for administrative support or to enable communication with patients or scheduling visits. Wellness apps, so software that's intended for maintaining or encouraging a healthy lifestyle. or software that provides patients with tools to just organize or track their health information. Software intended to serve as an electronic patient record or allow a patient to access their personal health information, or software intended to be used as an annotation tool for diagnostic reports. Finally, I just wanted to end with what's coming. Health Canada is looking at modernizing the clinical trial regulations. This is the CT Mod initiative. And I'll get you just to flip to the next slide. This is what has been proposed. Obviously, we haven't seen what has come out of this initiative yet, but we're excited for some of the potential pillars that Health Canada has identified, including proportional risk-based oversight. So perhaps there would be lessened regulatory requirements for lower risk trials. Single authorization of a trial, that would be great if we could get single authorization of a trial that includes, like I said, a drug and device and only have one application instead of two. Enabling decentralized trials, looking at agile life cycles across product lines, and then mandatory registration and public disclosure of results. So really excited to see what comes out of this. And I'm just waiting with bated breath.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Lori and Brianne. I think I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can see and discuss some questions. So this is the time, if you have some burning questions, to put them into the chat. But I think one of the questions I wanted to start with is really, and maybe this is a question for Brianne first and then one for Lori as well, is what, is something that has kind of surprised you, not maybe just in my trials, but in all of the trials that you've worked on in terms of a budget, has there been something that maybe caught you off unexpected that we should be thinking about? Any warnings to the wise from the wise?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think just overall, one of the main pieces is the variability that we see in terms of budget. And I think we tried to show that too with some of the examples. But something that really caught me off surprise is it goes back to that example around community sites. When we want to have community sites that are not embedded within an academic institution, all of a sudden the costs change. So we have unexpected costs for research ethics boards that need to be a community research ethics board, and legal reviews, access to SOPs. So a lot of institutions are members of N2, or the network of networks. They have access to suites of SOPs and things like that. And so when you're not affiliated with that group, what does that look like? And, there are some mechanisms that are in place that you can access some of those SOPs as affiliates of N2 members. But those are things that are not necessarily taken into consideration. So, again, a piece of advice is think about your sites early in the process. The site feasibility piece is really important. Understanding your sites and additional costs that might be incurred, insurance policies, as I had mentioned previously. Those are things that are not always thought of as we're seeking funding. And so they haven't been budgeted for. And then it makes it become really challenging to initiate and execute clinical trials.
You mentioned site feasibility as a part of figuring out what your budget is going to look like. And I think that's really important. And one thing actually just in my third trial that we started is really this feasibility collection up front of not only how many patients might you be able to recruit, but also do you have a research coordinator and do you have SOPs? So I think doing that in a structured way has been really helpful and something I've learned throughout the way. So happy to hear you advocate for that. And Lori, maybe same question. I know you've been involved in lots of different applications and regulatory approvals. Has there ever been something, where you were very sure it wasn't going to require an application and it did, or you were very sure it was going to require an application and it didn't?
All the time. All the time. Things are changing and moving between the drug space with our, we're seeing a lot of precision medicine and oligonucleotide therapies that are coming in. So this is opening up a whole new space for us to try to work within. Medical devices, and like I say, AI and machine learning has, I think, really come in and caught us a bit off guard. But I still have trials that come in and I'm like, I think this needs a CTA and the investigator doesn't. And, at the end of the day, it's always going back to Health Canada. Health Canada is always very open and very collaborative in terms of engaging with us to at least know if we have to do an application. The last thing I want to see is somebody not do an application and then go to publish and then get asked if they got Health Canada approval and they didn't. So To me, I want to make sure that obviously everyone, the institution's protected, the investigators protected, and that, this is regulation, right? This is not something that is optional. We have to be compliant, and we have to make sure that, we are working within the regulations and making sure the correct submissions get done.
And at the end of the day, that onus falls on the investigator, correct? And the sponsor to decide if I'm going to reach out to Health Canada to ask or not. Is that true? Or who is the ultimate onus on as to whether or not that CTA gets submitted? Like that would be on the sponsor and the investigator. Or is it something that research ethics boards govern, or does that look different everywhere? Like who makes that decision?
I think it kind of looks different everywhere. I mean, obviously the sponsor is not going to know unless the investigator, has brought it to their attention, right? So, and across Canada, who acts as a sponsor differs. In some cases, it's the institution. In some cases, it's the PI and the institution. In some cases, it's the PI. So it really varies. Ethics, it depends on the ethics board. A lot of ethics boards are really savvy and they pick up on a lot of these. Generally, in every ethics application, there's going to be a question in terms of, are you using this product, within the approved labeling, that's going to kind of prompt you to, do I need to do a CTA or not? But
I think all those resources of the directorates to look into is also a good part of your feasibility assessment early on.
absolutely, figure out ahead of time if you're going to, especially with devices. If there's another device out there that's going to do the same thing that you want to do with an unlicensed device, then maybe you're better off looking at a licensed product that's available. Sometimes people go to, conferences and they see something really cool and they want to use it, and then they find out what they're going to have to do to be able to use it. And it's a lot of work. So, upfront knowing what you're looking at in terms of a regulatory submission.
Yeah, I'm gonna ask a couple questions. There's some in the chat here, and I think I'm gonna go backwards up here, and Mo had a comment saying ethics won't process without a CTA, and I know that that's true at many sites, not all sites. Some sites you can go in parallel, but in many cases they won't. I know at my site we don't submit to our ethics board until we have that NOL, so I'm sure that's not common. That's not uncommon. And a question from Adrian says, do we have a plan here in Canada? I think this is a really relevant question about adjusting to the US changes. So in Canada, we've been really excited to sort of maybe implement some more of the US changes around diversity in clinical trials, diversity action plans, how we plan for recruitment of diverse populations. That all takes budget, right? We have to plan for all of that at the beginning if we're going to engage with different communities and try and expand our recruitment. And so I guess the question is, do we have any guidance in Canada around mandating collection of disaggregated data and addressing underrepresentation in participant populations? And I wonder if either of you can speak to those, and also if that's not the case, is there a plan for that in that modernization initiative?
I cannot speak to that. I don't know. To be perfectly honest, obviously, I think in CTMod, they're looking at a number of different things, and I'm thinking that inclusion, especially because we're looking at decentralized trials, right? Part of that is increasing trials to populations that do not normally have access to these trials, right? We want a more representative population in our clinical trials, especially, when we're looking at devices. If you're training a device, a machine learning device, you have to train it on a population that is representative of your country. So you have to have that diversity of your country represented, right? We have to be able to have more diversity in our clinical trials in Canada. And Health Canada will speak to that when we go to them and have these pre-CTA or ITA meetings, right? Especially with something like a tool that's being trained. We can't limit the population that we are training a device on.
Absolutely.
I don't have anything further to add to Lori. I think Lori summarized that well. I'm not aware of any specific guidance, but I do know that there are some institutions around data collection standards that are not mandated standards, but there has been some work that's underway through various different research networks and collaborations looking at how do we capture data and what types of data do we capture, but it does vary. I'm not aware of any specific guidance that's underway, but good question.
Yeah, and another great question for Lisa. I think like we talk a lot about involving patient partners in like designing a protocol and in choosing a research question and all of those things. But what is the maybe either of you could speak to the role of patient partners and people with lived experience in sort of the application and the operational side of things. So not just from a study design, is this the right question, the right outcomes, but from that really operation, like how can they help make our trials successful?
Yeah, so maybe I can speak to that piece first. I think again, early engagement is one of the key themes that we see in study startup budgets, but involving patients right from the get-go, right from the project conception. There's a number of groups and organizations, patient organizations that are available, but that can look like a variety of different things. That can look like their input on the actual grant application. What types of outcomes are important and meaningful to patient and family partners? Recruitment materials, study design components. So an example of that is decentralized clinical trials, setting up a trial in a way using patient and family input on the actual study design. Does it involve remote visits? Are there limitations in bringing patients? Is that a barrier to recruitment and retention? But then patients and family partners can also be involved in those recruitment materials and retention materials. I know that we've worked on several projects where patient and family partners have been actively involved in creating different forms of recruitment materials in terms of videos and stories, because it becomes a little bit easier to explain some of that information when it's coming in lay terms. And that patient and family perspective is crucial because when it comes from lived or living experience, it can be authentic and relatable to individuals. So there's a variety of ways that patients and family partners can be involved. They can also help support the ongoing trial activities with reviewing ongoing consent forms and things like that. Lori, I don't know if there's anything further you wanted to.
No, no, I think that was great. Like I say, that doesn't really touch on my world. So
Yeah, I don't think I don't think if I was a patient partner, I would want absolutely nothing I am a scientist. I want nothing to do with your world of paperwork, Lori. I think the one other thing that maybe Brianne, you could add in is around the reporting and the perception of the clinical trial, right? How do we communicate results back to patients? I think that as a clinical trial community, we have a lot of trust to build with the public around what clinical trials are and what we're learning and how they inform care. And I see patient partners as like one of the most valuable tools to become kind of insiders of like, no, don't worry, they're not so scary, I promise. Not, most of them mean really well and are here to do good work. And so I think that's a great way to involve some of the patient partners. There's another, a couple of links also involving KT. Good to hear that, Lisa. So there is an evaluation link in the chat. If you could please spend just a couple of minutes. And I just have one last, I don't see any new questions coming into the chat. So I think just a last question, and this is really more for you, Brianne, because I think, Lori, the flexibility with regulatory is burp. But for Brianne, my question is around changing costs. So you saw my trial that started in 2019, and now it's 2025, and we are 1 out of 20 of the way there. How do investigators and teams plan for changing costs, plan for these kinds of rolling starts? And is there any tips for sort of building in some structure to support that unknown of really when we're going to be able to do this work?
Yeah, excellent question. And I mean, also, Lauren, your trial happened during a pandemic. We can't plan for those things. So I think this goes right back to kind of the funding and the budget implication pieces. When you're building out a budget in contingencies. So cost of living increases. You might predict that that your clinical trial is going to wrap up in a year or 2 years, and as we've seen, it extends. So make sure that you're adding in those inflation costs. Same with shipping costs, travel costs. Add in inflation pieces right as you're beginning to budget for those projects. Now, the other thing too is considering the design of your actual product, your project and your protocol. Are there ways that you can have some decentralized components? Can some of the visits occur off-site? So you don't need to have facility fees, for example, but you can reduce some of those costs that way. The other piece too is thinking about the way that you capture data. So some of the information can be done directly from patients right into the database. So there are some flexibilities and ways to reduce study coordinator time if you can have more direct entry of things into your database, for example. The other thing too that becomes a little bit challenging if you don't have a study budget that has salaried positions, how does that work and how do you manage that? Another way to consider budgets that don't have the capability of having an FTE like a 1.0 or a 0.5 FTE, and I'm thinking more of like coordinator time, is scheduling budgets kind of in a hybrid model. So you might trigger payments based off of different milestones so that you can have some upfront cost that occur right at ethics approvals and contracts, for example. So you can have a chunk of money to help support the work. And then if the additional visits, you receive reimbursement or payment on a per patient basis, you will have received kind of a chunk of funds to get that individual in place and to get going. The other way that you can budget for some of these pieces too is if you do have to budget on a per patient visit, you can have, the first couple of patients have higher per patient visits, so that again, you can have your person in place and you can get them going, and then it can kind of taper. So there's a couple of different models that you can do, but I think it really goes back to, as you're planning for your budgeting, consider adding in pieces for those contingencies, inflation costs, and as long as you justify that with your funder. So I'm thinking if you're submitting to CAHR, include those cost of living increases over time, then they're more willing to be flexible and to approve those types of budgets. But it does become very tricky. I'm not underestimating or minimizing that. It does become important. And then too, from a study perspective, work with your service providers. Are there ways that you can reduce some costs? So I'm thinking in terms of monitoring. Can some of the monitoring visits be done remotely and reduce the cost for travel as opposed to all being on site? So again, it's thinking about study design and thinking about this early in the process as you're creating your budget.
Well, I think thinking about this early is a really good way to end, because I think that's the main message of today, is that this is a complicated space, and thinking about it early and asking questions and seeking out expertise is really the way to set yourself up for success. So thank you both so much.